Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bedbug Guys channel with another unsolicited ranting opinion. Today I want to talk about mainstream archaeology and alternative histories and why these people don't seem to get along. Why do archaeologists uh, dismiss these other people when they come out with their theories and the fight back and forth? Well, what's the issue? And I thought, well, maybe let's talk about the field of archaeology and then talk about a couple of the other alternative history fields and maybe wrap it up using the Great Pyramid as an example of how little mysteries can actually cause alternative historians to be viewed as mm, just not credible by mainstream archaeology. So, back in the day when I was a youngin', I originally did want to be an archaeologist, but since my dad decided he wasn't going to help me out with it, and it was going to cost a lot of money to get a degree in this, plus I figured out it's really hard to make a living doing this, I decided to pursue other means and just keep my interests to myself. So if we look at the field of archaeology, it's actually, as a profession, quite old. It goes into antiquity. For example, Ramses II's son, Khammurabi, was actually an archaeologist, because you got to realize that Egypt is very old, and even at the time of Ramses II, it was very old. And he used to go around to some of the older sites and do research and figure out who built something. He's one of the reasons that we think Khufu built the pyramid. Kind of left little plaques and stuff, like today, where you go along the road and something happened here, there's a bronze plaque, things like that. And then as you go forward, coming into the later times, within the last 500 years, it wasn't really a profession. It was more of treasure hunting or culture vultures. Culture vultures are people like Napoleon, who went in and took everything to just try to add to his. Romans were culture vultures off of the Greeks. People like that. So a lot of information comes that way. Then you have the treasure hunters, and a lot of information was gained through that. So you figure in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, anybody could be an archaeologist if you could convince someone to back you to go look for something. Or, a lot of museums would finance expeditions so they could get goodies for the museum, and a lot of times they would split these with the archaeologist, and also the archaeologist would have to split the goodies with the country which he was working. Only sometimes, not all the time. Anybody could be one. A lot of your Egyptologists were just rich guys from England who were bored and wanted to go out and do something, and they ended up discovering quite a few things, making a name for themselves. But as far as a scientific discipline, it really hasn't been that scientific. Maybe the last 100 years has it really been an academic discipline. Mostly people watched Indiana Jones, and you see most of the time he was a professor, and then he had the museum back him to go out and find something. That's pretty much the classical way it was done. Not really done that way anymore. So nowadays, if you want to be an archaeologist, or one of its subsets, because much like any other field, they have Egyptology, Central America, Amazon, they kind of disperse into their specialties. You're going to have to go to college for a few years, and then you'll realize that in order to make a living doing this, you're very limited. Okay, unless you're happy being a public high school history teacher and you want to go further, you really got to put in the work. So then you have to go get a graduate degree, get published. There is a lot of who you know and who you blow in this field. The really good jobs The really good jobs are museum curators and university professors, and they don't give those jobs up until they're almost gone, if you know what I mean. And even then, it's hard to get into that. So a lot of this is begging for money to go out and do your research, to get on excavations, which you may or may not get paid for as part of a team, but just to get your research, you work through all this. Maybe you work on a PhD, you do your research, you get published, it gets peer reviewed, and then bam, you're in the know. So then you're the guy, you become an expert on something. They need some excavation looked at. These people can make a good living doing that. It's not easy to do. Now, what we run into is, well, what would really, really tick these people off? The first thing that does that is, let's say you go through all this, you've gone through schooling, your undergrad work, you've been out in the field, you haven't made any money, you've done all your research, you get your PhD, you get published, you're known and blown, and going through life, you are the person in the know, and then all of a sudden one of your colleagues is working in the field, makes a find, and publishes, and that find in some way changes fundamentally the understanding of a site that you've worked on, more or less in scientific terms saying, hey, this previous one is wrong, here's the correct. For example, let's say they're working on a site and they find evidence that dates that site to be much, much older than what is commonly understood. And you'll see this in news or whatnot where it'll say, oh, they make a discovery in such and such a site that says that, people were there, 2,000 years earlier than what is commonly understood. And then you'll see articles saying, well, archaeologists are questioning the carbon dating, or they're questioning this. So they give a lot of pushback on that. Nobody wants to have their life's work basically be held back as wrong. And they'll fight it tooth and nail until a separate discovery is made that correlates with it, or they just can't fight it any longer. And then it becomes accepted canon. It's quite a process, and this goes on in every scientific field. You've got a guy who's been theoretical physicist his entire life, and some young gun comes along with a whole new set of math and stuff that says, hey, what we've understood from this guy is completely wrong. There's going to be tons of pushback and factions and whatnot. That's what you get there. Now, what'll really tick them off is if somebody comes up with an explanation for something. And just as the site said, so archaeologists will go out in the field, do all their research, and occasionally they'll come across an artifact or something that they really don't have a good explanation for, or they can't really explain something because they don't have a lot of data. So either they just give it some mundane explanation, ignore it, and the artifact is thrown in the back halls of a museum until somebody looks at it and says, what the heck is this? So like I said, what really ticks them off is if somebody comes along, does some research, comes up with a whole different explanation in theory for object or area or building, and doesn't go through the process that everybody else does. Instead of bringing it to them and getting published and writing papers, they write a book and take it directly to the public. That really takes them off. So then we'll talk about ancient astronaut theory, because that's more or less what happened. And the granddaddy OG, who's considered to be that, would be Eric von Daniken. And what he did is he looked at a lot of these mysterious objects with either no or some mundane explanation, or buildings – that archaeologists have failed to adequately explain. And he saw that perhaps, was there some sort of extraterrestrial intervention in all this history? And that's what this is saying. So he writes a book called Chariots of the Gods. And in it, that's with a question mark, he presents these different things and asks questions. Really, that's what the book is. I mean, it implies that this is what he believes, but he just asks the questions. Could this be? Could that be what this is? Just, you see my point of view. So back in the 60s and early 70s, this book really took off because everybody loves a good mystery, and this is a good explanation. Wouldn't it be wild? Becomes extraordinarily popular. And given that, he asked all these questions. You know, it's a legit question to ask. I mean, we have no proof either way. So could it be looked into? Well, it wasn't universally dismissed with fervor right away, but it's gotten that way. Because what happened is after Eric von Daniken, a lot of other people picked up the torch, this whole new generation, and expanded on this. And a lot of books were written, a lot of documentaries and whatnot, and it culminates in the TV show on the History Channel called Ancient Aliens. And what happened with that is it went on so long that they literally plugged themselves in the foot and have made it virtually impossible for academics to take them seriously. And let me explain why. What it appears they've done in the TV show is they are cherry picking something, either an object, a piece of text, a myth, or whatever, and then they build a narrative around it that goes to this was aliens, can't be anything else, and pretty much ignoring any evidence to the contrary, any physical or hard evidence to the contrary. And when that evidence is brought up, they literally say, well, they say that, but I don't think so. And if you don't believe me, just watch Ancient Aliens. That's literally what they say. So, example I gave for that is in the Who is King Sarid video I gave, which is, if you watch the show, when they talk about the Great Pyramid, they cite the medieval Arab historian al-Makrizi, who wrote The History of Egypt, which is more or less just a compilation of stories he got from other historians or people in the know in Egypt, or who seem to be in the know. And he compiled them together to try and explain all this. Because nobody could read hieroglyphs in the medieval times, so you just had to go with what people told you. And they do that for three reasons. One is one line from an Arab historian that he compiled that there can somehow, through 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, say that Enoch built the pyramids, and if you read the book of Enoch, he may or may not have been kidnapped by aliens. Another one is a line that says that the pyramids were built 300 years before the Great Flood, and that they were built for some magical purpose. Great, but if you can find the English translation of al-Makrizi's work, you'll find out he covered the pyramids extensively. And while they're saying this as evidence, they also say that the pyramid was not a tomb, it was built for some technological purpose. So in their source, al-Makrizi, they pick out those three things, and then they completely ignore that over and over it says that the pyramids were built as a tomb, who was buried in them, including detailed eyewitness accounts of people who broke in, of what was in there, and very detailed descriptions of the mummies. So, like I said, they cherry-picked and then ignored everything else. And it seems that's what they do, but it makes money. So while ancient astronaut theory in and of itself is not really bonkers and probably deserves some legit research, the people who have just carried that torch and ran with it have ruined any chances of that happening at this point. So that's what ticks them off. Now, another thing that ticks them off is somebody will come along research through their data and come up with the explanation that challenges the accepted timelines. And worse off, they could be right, and then enter the lost civilization theory. And the original, probably the OG that really got this going and out in the mainstream was John Anthony West, may he rest in peace, who was actually an academic, but he had different views on things, and he started to challenge the accepted timeline of history. And his big deal was the age of the Sphinx. And he got somebody else to come, a geologist, Robert Schoch, to come and look at the Sphinx. He says, I think the Sphinx is way older than the pyramids. It doesn't really match. He's probably right. And he kind of went about it, but he added a lot of the esoterics and the metaphysical into his argument, which, as any archaeologist, including Indiana Jones, will tell you, archaeology is the search for fact, not truth. So you got to stick with the facts. They're not concerned about the metaphysical and the esoteric. Explain the factual stuff first, then you can go with that. This torch was eventually picked up by Graham Hancock, who had an epiphany standing in front of the pyramids, and he has become the big voice on the lost ancient civilization. So he's really ticking them off by basically using their data and pointing out, hey, inconsistencies or evidence that would definitely point to older civilizations, pre-Ice Age or during the Ice Age. And personally, I happen to think that's probably true. I mean, you can't say that 300,000 years of modern humans being on this earth, I mean, that's the current accepted age, and critical thinkers didn't show up until about 10,000 years ago. I'm sure agriculture and civilizations have lived and died during those last 300,000 years, and possibly a big one, a global seafaring one. Got to find the evidence, and that's what he's feverishly trying to do. Well, that in their minds would undo everything they've done. So you've got all these academics who've worked their lives to become respected and to make the historical narrative and publish, and then all of a sudden somebody's going to come along and basically say you're all wrong. And worst of all, he might be right. So what happens with Graham is they don't necessarily universally dismiss him. So a lot of archaeologists will talk to him, will kind of in their specialty field agree and disagree, or agree to disagree, and it's mostly civil. But you do have a lot of academics who are, the community is really, really against this, primarily for that reason. And they will work to discredit him. Luckily, he does occasionally say things that make it easy for them. As I pointed out in my one little problem with Graham Hancock, is he will occasionally, and it really doesn't affect his research or argument either way, he will say something that is completely and demonstrably wrong as fact, like with conviction, and that allows them to say, oh, well, he can't even get that right. How we can now not take any of his research seriously. And I gave the example of him saying no Pharaoh's body has been found in any pyramid in Egypt, which is completely wrong. A simple Google search will correct you. Just, I'll make it easy. Look up the pyramid of Unas. Yeah. So if you can't just find it, you're not doing the research that would tell you that specifically that is an incorrect statement. He does it a few times. So why can we all get along? Well, they probably can't because of their attitude. So let's talk just a few little things about the Great Pyramid that get floated out there, and the different views of and why the academics aren't going to take them seriously. So there are tons of mysteries about the Great Pyramid. They pretty sure with Jean-Pierre Houdin's latest on the how the pyramid was built, that he could explain how the granite blocks were brought up and how the ramps were built and things like that. But there's still mysteries involved, granted. And so let's go over a few of them that they like to talk about as examples of either it was alien intervention or it's lost knowledge. Just some simple ones. The first one they love to talk about is the precision and the orientation of the pyramid. Graham loves to say, oh man, it's due north. That side is due north. It's on the 4 cardinal directions. Wow, this is big for a monument that big. How did they do that? I don't even think we could do that way today. It's off by a fraction of a degree. And you ask an Egyptologist, how did they align that pyramid so well? And the Egyptologist will tell you, there's no mystery here. They documented how they did it more than once. It's called the stretching of the cord ceremony. I'll show a picture here of one from the temple of Hatshepsut. And the stretching of the cord ceremony was a big deal whenever they laid out a building or a monument. Usually the pharaoh or a high official was involved, and they even had a goddess in charge of it. Her name was Seshat, and they took 2 poles with a rope in between it. And they would use them to align it, as it says in the text, with the stars or the sun. And anybody knows that during a solstice, if you put a pole up in the morning when the sun rises, its shadow is going to face due west. And you run a line around it, you're going to get the foundation wall going exactly east-west, and that wall is going to have a face of north. If you make 2 walls, the north wall and the southern wall, all you have to do is square it off, and then you get an east and a west. As a matter of fact, the Greeks used this system, and so did the Romans. He also says that, they've had trouble doing this throughout history. No, they haven't. Romans did it. Greeks did it. If you think they had trouble doing it, go to Washington, D.C. They were pretty good at it. The founding fathers of the United States were all surveyors, including George Washington. And if you ask a surveyor today, could you align that? As a matter of fact, with modern equipment, you can get those alignments within a nanometer. Almost exact. If you tell, you want your house oriented so that on your birthday, when the sun rises, it comes in the window and illuminates your bed, all he really needs is the degree and the day of year. And he can align that probably in about 10 minutes. And the only reason it took 10 minutes is because he had to update his social media. And you got to remember, as far as a nanometer is almost exact, a fraction of a degree is way off compared to that. So if you do these 2 poles, you set that, you're going to get pretty damn close, which is what it is. Pretty damn close. Not bad for a bunch of ancient people. Now, could that be older knowledge? Of course it could be. But it's not something that they could not do at the accepted time of when the pyramid was built. It could have been done way before. It definitely was done for a long time after. So that's not really a mystery, nor is it a giant feat as it's made out to be. Also, you got to figure in the precision, the base is not perfectly square. They have the north or the east and the west side are off by 14 centimeters. Things like that. But it is pretty good. They did a really good job. We'll give them that. And the next thing they like to talk about is the precision stonework. And they'll say, man, you can't even fit a piece of paper between these stones. And you picture the pyramid. Now, whenever they say that, you picture in your mind a pyramid, a giant mountain made of stone. And maybe in your mind, and I was guilty of this for a long time, that every stone was custom made and it fits together perfectly from all the way to the pyramidion, every stone inside there. Well, if you really look into it, I hate to change everybody's perception, but I'm going to tell you the truth. It's only precision stonework where it needs to be, and that's anywhere somebody could see it. The outside casing stones, passageways, rooms. Everything else is rough cut. And all you have to do is look at the top-down view of the Great Pyramid from a drone right now, because it's missing its cap, and you'll see that the core of the pyramid, which is 95% of the stone used to build that pyramid, quarried right there on site, is not even exact. It's rough cut. It basically looks like they're not even the same size. It looks like they went to the quarry next door and went, make them about yay big, but make sure the top and bottom are flat. And that limestone's pretty easy to cut. So they probably just hauled the blocks up, and if it needed to fit, they just trimmed it right there. So your outer casing stones are smooth, your passageways are smooth, the granite on the inside of the chamber is smooth, but everything's rough cut, okay? Which draws into the next thing, which is they like to say that it couldn't be built in 20 years. Therefore, it's either extraterrestrial intervention or it's lost technology, or it's much older. Well, the truth is nobody's thinking like a general contractor. Could you build it in 20 years? Yes. They definitely had plenty of money, according to the records, during that Khufu's time, at least. They had plenty of resources. They had a massive population. Only a small percentage had to be devoted to agriculture. They had plenty of general labor to draw from. 90% of the stone used to build the thing was literally quarried right there where they were building it. Okay? And only out of the millions of pounds of stone used to make the pyramid, only 50,000 pounds is granite from Aswan, 500 miles away. And it wasn't even used until they got halfway up the pyramid. So the Tura was from 8 miles away. That's the casing stones. So I don't know if people think, or they're thinking that each stone was custom made as they needed it. But you get crews of 20, they can haul those stones up one right after the other. And they had about 20,000 working on it. So, I mean, you don't build your house and you put up the first stud and you call the lumber yard and say, yeah, I need a 10-foot long 2x4. And so then the guy goes, okay, and he goes out and he cuts down a tree and he custom makes one 10-foot long 2x4, and they deliver it, and then you put it up and go, and then you go measure out 16 inches and go call lumberyard, okay, I need another one. No. They knew how much stone they needed, and as soon as they were laying the foundation, the guys would have been cutting the stone right there on site. So by the time they're ready to start pulling, they had tons of it. When you build a house, you order your materials beforehand. It just sits out there and you cut it to fit. So yeah, they didn't have regulations. They didn't have to wait 20 years to get a permit. Yes, they could have definitely built it in 20 to 30 years. Just that is a common misconception. Just because you look at the size of it and think, wow, and you should say, wow, they built that. Yeah, they could have done it in 20 years. These were brilliant engineers, hard workers. The workers were well paid. They had plenty of money, plenty of materials, plenty of labor. They were well organized. Yes, they could build this thing in 20 years. No, without question. You're discounting human beings or the Egyptians. And the question, could you build it today? You could, but you wouldn't. Because today it'd take 20 years just to get the permits, if they even gave them to you. You'd have a hard time getting insurance, because even OSHA wouldn't let you to build a pyramid that way. And even now, the materials and engineering are so much different. They could build you a bigger, better one that's lighter and last 20,000 more years. They just wouldn't do it. But back then, that's the way they had to do it. They didn't have concrete. They didn't, as far as we know, they didn't have steel skeletons. They couldn't do that in the modern way. They had to build it in the way that they could with what they had. Doesn't say there isn't some mysteries associated with this, but yes, they could have done it just out of brute force. So, with that, if you want to say extraterrestrials had a hand, there's no record of it. You have to prove it, which means somebody has to physically go out and look for it, and archaeologists sure aren't going to do that because they believe that's all been discredited. So at this point, finding until you find a papyrus, of an alien with a hard hat pointing at a pyramid, or they land and say, "Hey guys, here's a selfie of me working on the pyramid. Sorry we had to leave, but we had a cable appointment back on Nibiru, and they gave us 5,000-year window." Could have happened, And as far as the lost civilization thing, that's going to be really hard to prove, because at this point you can only prove that the site of Giza is probably older, but not necessarily the pyramid itself, which draws it into the next thing is ancient aliens. Of course, they use their Al-Makrizi and say Khufu didn't build it. Graham Hancock and the boys say there's no way it was Khufu. It's got to be older. I don't understand why. And they'll use there's nothing written in the pyramid, which is true. And there's no proof it was a tomb, also true. And we'll get into that in a second, why archaeologists think that. But why do archaeologists think Khufu built the pyramid? Why is that taught? Well, they'll tell you this isn't a guess, okay? Not only did the Egyptians say Khufu built it, so we're going with Kayamwa said the inventory still, up until recently, they found the boat that had the ship's log from Captain Mary Ray, his log was hauling Tura to Giza for Khufu. And there's really only one reason you'd be hauling Tura to Giza is you're working on a pyramid. So Khufu was definitely working on a pyramid. Also, recently they found the administrative city that literally oversaw this, and with all the food stores and everything, they've only excavated a fraction of it. It was buried under a soccer field. Well, they'd been in the soccer field, so they decided to excavate. That's very recently. And they've only excavated a small part of it. There's also a giant industrial harbor attached to it right there at Giza, big enough to haul giant stones off of the ship. I still don't. That's a mystery I want solved. How the hell did they get those granite beams off the boat into the pyramid? Not just how they got it up. How the heck did they get it? Somebody else can theorize that. And in there, Khufu's seals for the grain bags. So this was his money, lots of them, plus his administrators. People who were involved, like Hemiamun. Here's another reason that Khufu probably built. Not only that, there's a giant cemetery next to the pyramid that's full of construction workers. You got your low ones just buried right there, but there's also some tombs of overseers. We know the stone gangs had names, like their teams, like Friends of Khufu. Khufu. So his name shows up all around this, including in contemporary time. He spent his own money on it, something big on the plateau. The boat log says they were shipping stone. It obviously, if nothing else, he had a major part in building that pyramid. Well, the question is, did he start it or did he finish it? That is the true mystery. But the evidence shows that he definitely had something to do with it. Definitely had something to do with it. In a big way. So they just, in context, the archaeologists say, well, he built it from start to finish. And, ancient aliens will say, nope, aliens did a long time ago. They won't even say maybe aliens gave him the plans. And their lost civilization, just for whatever reason, just dismiss it. I don't know why. You can still have Khufu built the pyramid, or Khufu was involved in the construction of the pyramid, and still have the site be older, because it probably is. Egypt is a very old civilization. Okay? Now, let's move into, both of them say that it wasn't a tomb. Ancient aliens and the lost civilization say that the Great Pyramid was not a tomb. It was not intended to be a tomb. It wasn't Khufu's tomb, to be more specific. There's no evidence of that. Now, that is true. There is no evidence. So pretty much everybody's theory on what the pyramid was supposed to be for is good until they're all proven wrong or one is proven right. So let's ask, well, why do archaeologists say that it was a tomb or it was built as a tomb, let alone Khufu's tomb? Well, the reason is when you do archaeological excavations, a lot of is not just finding something and dating something or writing. You have to have context. So in the context of the pyramid it sits in the middle of a giant cemetery, specifically a cemetery full of Khufu's friends, family, administrators, construction workers. It's a giant cemetery. They're all Khufu's right there around the pyramid. So in context, you have circumstantial evidence that Khufu had something to do with building the pyramid, but then you had the contextual evidence that says that this is a cemetery monument. You see what I'm saying? But so they're using context in their experience. They say that's what it is. I would say until, for all three of you, give your opinion until one of you is proven right or wrong. But I don't think it's something you could really fight about tooth and nail. Okay? So in that you could see the different attitudes that go toward this, where ancient aliens are like, well, they must have had something to do with it. They build a narrative about it off of cherry-picked evidence that really doesn't say anything. You have people like Graham Hancock who may have a point, but they're arguing the wrong things. So in Graham's case, he's either, as he'll use the example of no pharaoh's been found in a pyramid in Egypt, to bolster his argument that that's not what it was, or that it's older, or somehow the Egyptians couldn't have done that, but he's firmly on board with a bunch of hunter-gatherers building Göbekli Tepe. When an organized civilization with a ton of money and know-how and engineering knowledge couldn't. I don't know where he makes that connection, but you know what? That's up to him to prove. So, and archaeologists will tell you, well, they're fully capable of doing it. They built monuments long after that. Okay. Obviously they knew. Another thing likes to be said is ancient aliens and Graham Hancock will say, well, they quit building pyramids at the end of the Old Kingdom. Either the aliens left because of that cable appointment on Nibiru, or it was they lost the knowledge. Now, if you ask an archaeologist, and it goes back to this, does any of you actually read, read hieroglyphs, read the context, know the history, look at the papyrus, or ask somebody why they quit building pyramids? It's not a mystery. It's a couple things. One, it's economic. So they kept detailed records of the rise and fall of the Nile, and that's how they determined how much money they had. It was an agrarian society. Their wealth was in the agriculture. The Nile flooded every year and inundated the valley, and how high it flooded determined how much farmland was available. Okay, so if you had record high floods, you were making money. That means there was tons more farmland. A 1 foot difference in the Nile is a huge amount of farmland. If it's a foot less, you're getting a whole lot less money. During the time of Khufu, it flooded really high. So they were making gangbusters money. They had plenty of money to build a pyramid or two. But as time went on, the Nile quit flooding quite so high. So the subsequent pharaohs didn't quite have the money to build humongous pyramids to emulate the three on the Giza Plateau. Something else also happened. A few hundred years after the pyramid was built, the Egyptian civilization collapsed. It's the only civilization on Earth that has collapsed twice and completely rebooted and restarted like nothing ever happened. And that would be during what would be called the reign of the Hyksos. It was about 150 to 200 years. There were Semitic people who ruled from we'll call it Lower Egypt, but North Egypt in the Delta, in a city called Avaris. And then in Upper Egypt or the South, you had the Theban princes. Okay, Well, during this period, apparently the economy was horrible. People just were miserable. There was papyri written by people of how horrible it was. And as a matter of fact, during this time, not only were they not building pyramids, but every last pyramid was looted during this time because they needed money. So when the Hyksos were expelled and the new pharaoh came on board, the guy remembered they knew that every pyramid had been looted because a lot of them had been involved. So they switched really to a different type of burial where they were hiding their tombs underground and then building a funerary temple elsewhere. And that was the practice for pretty much from then on. So that's two factors. They'll tell you why they didn't build pyramids. It wasn't because the aliens went away. It wasn't because they lost any knowledge. They clearly knew how to do mega construction projects well up until the time Cleopatra died. That's not an answer. There is no mystery there, guys. So the archaeologists are right about that. Why? Because it's documented. It is literally documented. You can learn to read hieroglyphs and you can go read it yourself. So in the end, can these guys get along at all? Well, attitudes have to change on all three sides. First of all, the archaeologists and the Egyptologists will have to admit that there really are some mysteries involved that they don't have the answer to because they don't have the data. And they should just really be like, you know what, I don't know. Not just to challenge anybody who brings up an ulterior theory. They should go, well, could be. You have to go prove it. Okay? The same goes for them. So when you talk about, there's a bunch of mysteries. How the heck did they make those little granite vases and stuff? And they should just say, I don't know. Don't try and come up with some mundane explanation that everybody's going to think is, and then here's where all the people are going to write books and make more money than you. The ancient aliens people are actually going to have to sit back and do some actual research and not assume things. Just because you can look at something and say, oh, that was aliens, doesn't mean you have to build an entire narrative around it. If you think it's aliens, actually use concrete evidence to prove it. Don't cherry pick or make up a story. If you think it was an extraterrestrial, run with it. That show should stick to the actual stuff that looks like it might have been extraterrestrials. Well, figurines and stuff. Some of the cave paintings. Right now, it's more or less just a UFO show. Now, as far as Graham Hancock and the other people are concerned, I think they're gaining traction, but they're still going to get a load of pushback. And I think what they need to do is, in their case, dial back on some of the metaphysical and the esoteric, and just focus on facts. That's going to get you the respect. But when you focus on the facts, guys, make sure the facts that you're saying are actually correct. Because sometimes it's the little things that are going to get you in trouble. It really is. Little things. You'll probably get some more traction if you just focus on facts and not go, there's a conspiracy. You know, there is, but not tight to the extent that you think it is. Don't give them a reason to discredit you. That's my main advice. If they do that, they could probably all get along. So basically, ancient aliens people would have to admit that archaeologists have found evidence that certain things have nothing to do with aliens, and lost ancient civilization, lost technology people would have to admit to things that are in the archaeological record that they are wrong about, and just focus on what really they need to focus on. Other than that, I got nothing else to say. Just a little ranty rant on these people. I'm just some exterminator from Florida. What do I know? Anyway, I appreciate a comment, a like, a hate, whatever you got. For that, maybe until the next rant, maybe I'll do something about the paranormal. I'll talk to everybody later. Bye-bye.